I'm with Stephen Jaffe from Northern Ireland Friends of Israel. Now, Stephen, were you surprised about what took place on October the 7th?
Well, it came as a huge shock, Paul. If you remember, it was a festival day. It was Shabbat here in the UK, in the Jewish diaspora. We were in the last 2 days of our festival period. News came quite slow. It wasn't clear at the beginning the scale of what had happened by any means, but it slowly dawned on us that this was off the scale in terms of the loss of life, in terms of the massacre. So a huge shock, not just for myself personally, of course, but for the Jewish communities around the world and our many friends from beyond the Jewish community as well.
Mm. Now, you wear many hats, and one of those has been with Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service. How did they respond to all of this?
Well, it will come in no surprise to you, Paul, that the organisation has taken a real battering. 9 of our paramedics were murdered on the 7th of October. Others were seriously injured. Some of our life-saving equipment was destroyed. For instance, 4 ambulances in the city of Sderot on the Gaza border. And the organisation's basic supplies of bandages, blood bags, oxygen masks, etc., things like this were very much depleted because of the scale of the atrocities of that day. Since the 7th of October, Magen David Adom has remained on its highest alert, red alert for Magen David Adom. That means every ambulance is staffed by paramedics 24/7, prepared to respond to any incidents that's needed. An aspect of Magen David Adom's work is that they're responsible for over 90% of the blood supply in Israel. So you can imagine there was a huge strain there as there was a demand for blood to cope with well over 5,000 injured. And thankfully, as a result of a blood drive throughout Israel, people were queuing up to donate blood. So the blood supply was quickly exhausted, but then replenished. So it has been a very hectic, very tragic time. We've lost some wonderful paramedics in very, very tragic circumstances.
Mm. Did ambulances have to come from all over Israel to the Gaza area?
Well, don't forget the attack from Gaza was accompanied by a barrage of missiles which landed right across Israel. That meant that a lot of ambulances were tied up dealing with a response to missile attacks across the country. But what happened, Paul, is Magen David Adom is a very decentralized ambulance service. It's made up predominantly of volunteers. About 3/4 of the staff are volunteers. That means there are paramedics in every village, in every kibbutz, in every moshav across the country. And that means they can deploy very, very quickly. And what happened on the 7th of October is that Magen David Adom paramedics were turning up at scenes where before or prior to the deployment of the Israeli Defense Forces. Therefore, they were finding themselves on the front line of areas that had been overrun by Hamas. Unfortunately, some of them paid with their lives because of the speed of their deployment.
Mm. They were actually physically driving into danger, were they? Because there was Hamas terrorists actually physically on the road shooting at vehicles. So were they driving into that conflict?
Absolutely. And I'm afraid to say there was no respect given to ambulances and they were ambushed, shot. Some of our paramedics in very tragic circumstances. There was a young girl called Amit Man. She was 22 years old. She was one of our youngest instructors, and she was on Kibbutz Be'eri. And when the missiles began to land, she went straight to the community health center on the kibbutz to tend to the injured. When it became clear that the kibbutz had been overrun, she locked the doors. She was in touch with the dispatch center, the Magen David Adom dispatch center in Tel Aviv. It soon became apparent that the terrorists were trying to gain entry into the health center. She was able to make last contact with her family. The health center was then attacked. She was murdered as she tended to the ill and the dying in the health center at the kibbutz. So a very tragic story there, which is replicated, I'm afraid, many times over.
Mm. I've seen video footage from the music festival. It must have been quite a shock for the ambulance service to actually arrive at that scene.
Horrific. You're beyond horrific, dangerous and horrific. There's a story there that I'd like to share with you, Paul. It doesn't involve a Magen David Adom paramedic, but it was a paramedic with a private ambulance service that was covering the music festival in quite the same way that in the UK you might expect St John Ambulance to be covering an event of that kind. The first casualties were brought to his ambulance post. It soon became clear that the that the music festival was being attacked and a massacre was taking place. The instruction was for everyone to escape. This young paramedic was an Arab from Nazareth. He said, I can speak Arabic. Maybe I can intervene with the attackers. Maybe I'll be able to cope. He refused to abandon the ambulance post where he was treating the injured, the wounded and the dying, and he was murdered there as well. And we shouldn't forget that all sections of Israeli society were attacked on that day, and we should remember the great blessing that he was to looking after the injured at that horrible scene.
These people are heroes, really, aren't they?
They are, and unfortunately Israel hasn't had the opportunity, I think, to take a breath and salute these heroes and remember them as they should be. But yes, I think that is often a word that's overused, but I think these people are absolutely heroic. They died at their post trying to save lives.
Are the Magen David Adom needing help today? Are they raising money for equipment?
So absolutely, we launched an emergency appeal. I'm delighted to say the response to that has been very generous. Here in the UK, I can tell you we've had responses from a Bible study group on the Shetland Islands and a group of churches on the island of Jersey and every conceivable place in between. So it's coming from the Jewish community, of course, very supportive, but beyond the Jewish community. And a lot of our Christian friends, we have a very active Christian friends of Magen David Adom, they are also responding to this emergency appeal in order that Magen David Adom can quickly replenish its basic supplies. We know that it doesn't just have to replace the ambulances that were destroyed. It needs to greatly increase its ambulance fleet to meet any future crisis, war in two fronts, whatever it is. They need to greatly increase the fleet of ambulances. And the response to the emergency appeal has been very generous indeed.
Now, today, on another subject, we're seeing pro-Palestinian demonstrations, which is their legal right. But are you worried about what's being said in those demonstrations?
Well, alongside the demonstration, Paul, I'm talking here specifically about the UK, but this is something that's happening across the world. There's a great surge of anti-Semitic incidents. I'm talking about physical assaults, verbal assaults, a lot of hate. And the question is, are these large marches contributing to a very negative, hostile, and hate-filled atmosphere? I think they are. That's not to brandish everyone who attends a pro-Palestinian march with being extremists or hatred, but even if they're a small but significant percentage of any march, that is a lot of people. And there's been, I myself was racially abused on the streets of London. I don't wear my kippah, my Jewish skull cap, when I'm out and about anymore. There is a sense of great apprehension within the Jewish community, and it's understandable given the size of these crowds. Some of the extremist language used about Israel, in other words, this isn't about making Israel a nicer and better place. This is about eliminating and exterminating the state of Israel. The refusal of many demonstrations to acknowledge that the massacre of the 7th of October even took place. The horrendous tearing down of posters for the Israeli hostages, the 200 or so souls who are being held in Gaza, including babies, children, and the elderly. We're seeing posters for them being torn down on the streets of London. This is a powerful and very, I think, very scary brew of the kind of extremists on the hard left, of radical Islamists, and then a whole tale of people who might be, in their own minds, progressive, concerned about human rights, concerned about casualties in Gaza, but turning a blind eye to who they're actually marching with and who are the organizations who are actually organizing these marches. These are questions which I think people should be asking themselves if they are participating in these marches.
It must be really sad for you as an Orthodox Jew to hide your faith. And, this is sounding in some ways like the starts of the 1930s in Germany.
So a lot of people are talking along those lines, Paul. That is part of what I would say is the Jewish discourse at the moment. Do we have a future in this country? People talking along those lines. I think there are big differences between the 1930s. The government is on side in the UK. We have difficulties with the police service and some of their responses to events, but they are there to protect when we demonstrate as well. That wouldn't be the case in 1930s Germany. And the big difference, Paul, I don't need to tell you, is that we have a state of Israel, which we didn't have in the 1930s. And that is a huge insurance policy for Jews around the world, wherever they live, that they're not totally dependent on the goodwill of the host societies of wherever they're living, because sometimes that goodwill dissipates, that they do have a place to go should they need to. So those are the, I think, crucial differences that we shouldn't lose sight of. And we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that I think a large majority of British people do share with us a deep concern about seeing radical Islamism on our streets, on seeing extremist left-wing sentiment on our streets. So I think there is a large section of the population here in the UK who do see it. They may not be taking the streets themselves. They may be quiet in their views, but I think there is a large section of the population here which shares with the Jewish community a concern about law and order, about how you balance freedom of speech alongside a zero tolerance towards racism and hate speech.
Is this war exposing something that's always been there, or has it got worse since the war?
I think it's something that has boiled up over a number of years, because I remember the community was in crisis in 2014 during the conflict at that period. I could go back even further, 2009. There was a deep crisis, of course, a political crisis when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, leader of Her Majesty's opposition. He's on record to say that he's a friend of Hamas, a friend of Hezbollah. His attempts to backtrack on that are not particularly, I believe, particularly convincing. So the community, the Jewish community, goes through periods of intense crisis. And then when the crisis is over, there is a tendency to go back to how life was before, to try and pretend things are okay, when in fact there are underlying trends here which are getting worse.
How safe do you feel in Northern Ireland?
Well, I actually live in London, Paul. I should
Oh,
say
right,
that
okay.
from the start, but I do visit Northern Ireland, and I was there quite recently with a man called Lord Mann. He's a former Labour MP, John Mann MP, and he's the government's advisor on anti-Semitism. And we brought him over to Belfast to meet the political parties. The discourse over there is very, very harsh. You'll see Israeli flags flying in Protestant and loyalist areas, and you'll see Palestinian flags flying in Republican and Catholic areas. And it's one of the ways I think that these two communities relate to each other, is how they demarcate their territory by using the flags of the Middle East. But it does mean that the discourse from those who are hostile to Israel is very, very harsh indeed. And that is frightening for what is in Northern Ireland a very small Jewish community, long established, well-respected community, but feeling that the society around them is hostile, which is very sad to see.
This is really anti-Semitism when you tell the Jews they can't do what everybody else is doing as well, isn't it? You know, America and the UK went in after 9/11 and attacked Afghanistan and attacked Iraq. So why can't Israel also deal with Hamas, which is a terrorist organization?
And a terrorist organization on its actual border. I think that's the point to bear in mind. In the other cases that you mentioned, Western countries went to war on the other side of the world to protect their interests. Israel is protecting the basic right of life of its citizens, who are living in some cases, meters away from where Hamas was in stronghold. And those who call for an immediate ceasefire may well have humanitarian considerations at the heart of that, but there is a deep concern as to whether they are aware of the fact that what they're calling for would result in Hamas retaining control of Gaza, of retaining the ability to mobilize, of carrying out its explicit threat to undertake attacks on the same scale as the 7th of October again and again. If you're calling for an immediate ceasefire, I think it's incumbent on you to say to the Israelis, and this is how we're going to secure you and your citizens, because if you haven't got an answer to that particular issue, then you're asking of Israel something you would never ask of your own country. And you're absolutely right. At the heart of it is a double standard, which is being imposed on the Jewish people and the state of Israel as the Jewish state.
Mm. Now, Hamas's attack was very, very successful in that sense. So do you see that the Palestinians are going to be working together for more large-scale attacks?
Well, I don't know to the extent to which Hamas and other groups work together. I think there's an element of Fatah who haven't forgotten how Hamas took control of Gaza and threw their colleagues off the tops of roofs. They've tried to kind of unite in the past, but they can't get around the fact that they despise and hate each other and have often resorted to violence and torture against each other. Whether the example that some might see, the great example of Hamas resistance, will bring them together, I doubt it. I think the divisions of Palestinian society are much deeper than that. And yes, Hamas can work with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement. They're working with Hezbollah, and Iran is orchestrating the whole thing. But I'm not sure whether Hamas has the ability to attract support from other sections of the Palestinian community, but I'm not an expert on that.
With the rise of anti-Semitism, do you think it's time for the Jews to come home back to Israel?
Well, I would like the Jews to come home for good reasons. I'd love to say I'm coming back to Israel to retire because it's a lovely, peaceful, and wonderful place to be Jewish, rather than being hounded out of the country because of a rise of anti-Semitism. The answer to that is each Jewish person will come to their own opinion on that. I know many Jewish people who will talk about making Aliyah. I think in France, we might see an upsurge. The UK, perhaps less so at the moment. But I think every Jew, as I've said, regards Israel as their ultimate insurance policy. I think a lot of people talk symbolically of having a packed suitcase. There's a Labour MP called Margaret Hodge, by no means the most kind of observant Jew or the most self-identifying Jew for much of her career, but she was the daughter, I believe, of refugees from Nazism. And she said that her parents had always taught her, keep your case packed. You never know when you might have to leave. And that's something which I think is deep in the Jewish psyche.
What is your prayer at this time?
Well, we're commanded to pray, Paul, for the peace of Jerusalem, and I can't think of any time where that is more appropriate and more needed. And I would call upon people of faith, Christian people, Jewish people, people generally of good faith, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, that Israel and all its inhabitants should live at peace without fear of attack. And I believe that that will happen, that Israel will prevail, that Hamas will no longer be able to govern Gaza in the way that it has done in the past. And that is my prayer at this time.
Are you encouraged how the church has rallied round Israel at this time?
I think it's very mixed. I would have to be honest with you in that one. In London this weekend, there's going to be a vigil which various Christian ministries have organized, and many, many Jewish people will be coming to that. And I hope they will see when they come to that vigil in central London that Christian support is there. But it would be wrong to say that that is kind of general, that we have mainstream churches here, many of which have been silent. And that silence is very loud, if you know what I mean. It resonates for the Jewish community when churches remain silent. The Archbishop of Canterbury has spoken out on occasion, but I would say, like lots of sections of British society, for instance, the world of football, very different world perhaps, where they have marked Black Lives Matter, where they've shown their support for LGBTQ communities and other causes. The Football Association in England refused to mark a football match played immediately after the Hamas atrocities to mark their respect for the dead and the abducted. And I think that kind of silence from a lot of British society has hurt the Jewish community very deeply.
What's your website for MDA if people would like to help?
Yeah, so for more information about the emergency appeal that I mentioned with Magen David Adom and an opportunity to make a donation, is through the website mdauk.org, mdauk.org.
Okay, Stephen. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate the opportunity that you've given. Thank you very much indeed.